All right, this exciting video is all about updating the budget, the LRS budget tab, and updating the LP at winter reflections time. So I'll start with the changes to the LP because this is an area that has shifted slightly since fall reflections time. So at fall reflections time, you're asked to put the date and the change or put the date and none. At winter reflections time, we're asking that if there are updates to the LP, then you put the date and the addition or the date and the deletion. So we need to know when that goal was added. If there are no additions, we ask that you just put none with no date. And this is different. Unfortunately, this didn't come out until after fall reflections were done. But if you do it this way, then at spring reflections, if there weren't any changes again, you don't have to update that with a new date. You simply just leave it as none. So it will just streamline things. So some of you have it as none and some of you have it with a date and none. So regardless, we'd like anytime there's a none in the LP and the changes to LP section, the additions and deletions, that you leave it, write it just as none. And I'll show you a sample here on the self-designing tab here. You can see that for additions, it's just none, and deletions, it's just none. And that's helpful, and hopefully that will save time at spring reflections. All right, there are a few situations when you're updating where, and these are examples pulled from the guidelines, so just to be clear that when you're updating, if there were no updates at the fall, and again there's none at the winter, just make sure that it just says none with no date there. If there were updates at the fall and there are more updates at the winter reflections, for example here, the top line, you leave the additions from the fall and then you add another line with the date and the addition below. And then if there were no deletions, then you would make sure it just says none with no date. If there were updates, there were no updates at the fall, but now there are updates at winter, you simply take out the none, because here there would have been none at fall, and now you'd make a new date and add it. You just remove the none completely, so it just shows that there are now updates. It's clear that there weren't any before this. And if there are updates only at fall reflections, then you would just leave it as is. You just leave that update and don't add anything. So we don't need to add none if there's already something in there. I guess that's the difference. So that's the changes to the LP. Let's look at the changes to the LRS budget. So there was a very, very specific and detailed video done in the fall about making updates to the LRS budget. So if you have questions about how to do that specifically, you should check out that video, which is in the Fall Reflections Guidelines found atop the LC conference in All Pro Growth documents. And I'll just briefly touch on the things that need to be included in this budget at this time, things that need to be done with the budget at Winter Reflections time. As always, you update that last updated date every time you come to this page so that we know that it's an ongoing updating is happening. You make any additions or any deletions, and the way you do this is always by adding the addition or the deletion in the next blank row. You don't fiddle with the X's here or here in the same row. You just leave the item as is. So for example, Frozen Planet, when that one was added and then later on it was deleted, but you don't do it right here in the first row. This LC actually made another row and did the deletion there. That keeps this gray column, which auto calculates the total, so it's easy to see how much is planned for. So always any additions or deletions go in a new row below. If you just need to change a dollar amount, say French lessons that were planned for $150 are now going to cost $300, you can just change that amount. As long as it's not a new item or an item that's deleted, that's totally fine to just adjust the amounts. Please ensure when you're adjusting, adding, and deleting that the total amount stays within the ceiling of 1020, which is the total amount for somebody who's using checks, and $985 is the budgeted amount for those who are using Visa. If the item is a loan program item, so if they've gone through the loan program and been approved to purchase an item, just make sure you include it in the resource description, and that way it is clear that that item is loaned until it depreciates enough to be owned by the family. As always, when you're adding and deleting and changing the budget, please ensure that you keep in mind balance between core and non-core areas. And also keep in mind the approvable items as found atop the LC conference in that spreadsheet, where it delineates the approvable and non-approvable items and consumables and non-consumables. And this is sort of the last mid-year reflections we have. So we had fall reflections, we have winter reflections, which is mid-year, and then our last reflections, that's at the end of the year. So in order to be planning ahead instead of wrapping it up at the end of the year, it's a good idea to encourage your families now to flesh out the rest of the budget as much as possible. We know that it may not be possible to get everything down, but just a reminder that this is sort of the last official time when we'll be doing an update. Of course, you can continue to update through the rest of the year, but at this official time, it would be wise to get as much as you can onto the budget at this time. And that's it. That is the updating the LRS budget and updating the LP.